The world doesn't often stop to pay attention to international summits. Most of the time, they feel like long speeches, polite handshakes, and vague promises. But on September 8th, 2025, something very different happened. Something big. Brazil's President Lula da Silva called an emergency last-minute virtual summit of BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their newly expanded partners. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't ceremonial. It was a crisis meeting in response to what Lula called nothing less than tariff blackmail by the United States. Just days before, Washington had dropped a hammer on global trade. 50% tariffs on Brazil and India, 30% on South Africa. To many, it looked less like economic policy and more like economic warfare. And so, for 90 minutes, the leaders of more than half of humanity, countries representing over 55% of the world's population and 40% of global GDP, closed the door, turned on their cameras, and began plotting a counterstrike that could reshape the very order of the world. This was not business as usual. This was the Global South saying, enough. And before we dive into exactly what was decided, 5 game-changing moves that could shift us from a unipolar world to a multipolar one, let me pause here. If you find value in deep dives like this, where we unpack not just what happened, but what it means, please hit the like button and share this video. It really helps bring more people into the conversation. All right, let's get into it. The first big move was what Iranian President Pezeshkian called a unified economic shield. The idea is simple but powerful. If one BRICS country is targeted with sanctions, all of them respond as one. No more isolation. No more picking countries off one by one. Xi Jinping condemned the growing wave of hegemonism, unilateralism, and protectionism. Putin, who has lived under Western sanctions for years, likely had a hand in shaping this strategy. And the message was unmistakable. Sanction one, sanction all. But here's where the discussion took a human turn. Leaders pointed to research published in The Lancet Global Health, showing that unilateral US and EU sanctions have caused over 560,000 excess deaths every single year, most of them children. In 5 decades, that's almost 29 million lives. Think about that. Sanctions are often discussed like numbers on a balance sheet, but behind those numbers are children, families, people who simply never had a say in the politics that shaped their fate. The BRICS shield, they argued, isn't just about economics, it's about survival. Decision number 2, accelerating de-dollarization. We've been hearing about this for years, countries slowly moving away from the US dollar in trade and finance. But this summit? It gave that process rocket fuel. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov bluntly announced additional steps to counter what he called the West's illegal actions in finance. BRICS leaders are pushing harder than ever to settle trade in local currencies, develop new payment systems, and build an alternative to the Western-dominated dollar world. Here's the scale. BRICS countries collectively control over $60 trillion in financial assets, more than half the global total. If they really commit to building parallel financial systems, the implications are staggering. Imagine a future where oil deals, infrastructure contracts, and major trade agreements don't need to touch the dollar at all. It doesn't mean the dollar disappears overnight, but its dominance, its leverage, could fade fast. And here's a hook for you. Think of it this way: the US has long used the dollar as its ultimate geopolitical weapon. What happens if that weapon stops working? The third decision was all about global governance. Xi Jinping said it outright. The world needs a more just and equitable global governance system. Lula pushed for expanding the UN Security Council to include permanent members from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Egypt's President El-Sisi didn't mince words either. Confidence in the UN Security Council is collapsing. This wasn't about rejecting the UN. It was about demanding reform. BRICS leaders are making a play to represent the voice of the Global South, the majority of humanity that's often excluded from the biggest decisions. And let's be honest, if these institutions don't adapt, they risk becoming irrelevant. By the way, let me ask you here, what do you think? Should the UN Security Council expand to include more countries, or would that just make it less functional? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear where you stand. Decision 4. Trade reorientation. Instead of relying so heavily on Western markets, BRICS wants to build resilient supply chains within their own sphere. Lula called for secure options to counter protectionism. India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar pushed for the democratization of manufacturing across geographies. The vision is bold: shorter supply chains, diversified production, less vulnerability to any one power center. And China's Belt and Road Initiative is poised to become the backbone of this shift, connecting ports, roads, and digital infrastructure to make intra-BRICS trade smoother and safer. Indonesian President Prabowo put it bluntly, "In today's world, might makes right." For smaller countries, that means constant risk of intimidation. This trade reorientation is about building an insurance policy against that. Decision 5 was perhaps the boldest: WTO reform. President Lula called the World Trade Organization paralyzed. He wasn't wrong. The WTO has been stuck for years, unable to enforce its own rules while unilateral tariffs and protectionism spiral out of control. But here's the twist: BRICS isn't walking away. They're demanding that it function as intended. She called for strengthening the WTO, not replacing it. Jaishankar stressed that trade must be open, fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. And yet the subtext was clear. If the WTO doesn't reform, BRICS may build something better. That's an ultimatum. Timing, as they say, is everything. And this emergency summit was timed perfectly, just one day before the UN General Assembly opened in New York. Lula made it clear: BRICS would go to the world stage with a united voice, demanding revitalized multilateralism. Egypt, Indonesia, South Africa all echoed the same sentiment. BRICS is no longer just an informal club. It's becoming, in the words of President Subianto, a strong pillar of stability and hope. So what does this all mean? Simply put, the September 8th Emergency Summit was a turning point. For decades, the global system has been dominated by one power center: the United States and its allies. That unipolar moment is ending. We are entering a multipolar world, a world where BRICS nations, representing the majority of humanity, demand a real seat at the table, where financial systems, trade routes, and governance structures are no longer controlled by one side. Of course, this won't be smooth. Building parallel systems is costly and complicated. Reforming institutions will face fierce resistance. And yes, the US and its allies will push back. But the momentum is undeniable. And once it starts, history tells us it's very hard to reverse. So, here's the bottom line. In the face of tariffs and economic coercion, BRICS chose unity. They chose reform over abandonment, cooperation over confrontation. And in doing so, they may have just accelerated the end of one world order and the birth of another. Whether you see that as hopeful or worrying, one thing is crystal clear: the world just changed. And if you want to understand the future, you can't ignore what happened in that 90-minute emergency meeting. If you found this breakdown valuable, don't forget to subscribe, ring the notification bell, and hit that like button so you don't miss future deep dives. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.